Commander Vorik sat in his office on the great warship Eternal Thunder. He was reading reports from across the Coalition fleet. Most of them were boring. Supply requests, training updates, the usual things that filled his days. Then he found a message from the training moon called Kethis 4. He almost deleted it without reading. Kethis 4 was where the Coalition sent its failures. Young warriors who could not pass their tests. Cubs who had no future in the military. It was a forgotten place, and everyone knew that assignments there were punishments, not opportunities. But something made him open the message. It was a request for live combat deployment. 40 felon cubs were asking to be sent to a real battlefield. Vorik laughed out loud. The sound echoed in his empty office. Felon cubs from Kethis 4? Those were the worst of the worst. They had failed every test. They had no discipline. They fought like wild animals, all instinct and no control. Sending them to real combat would be sending them to die. He was about to close the message when he noticed an attachment. It was a file containing combat simulation scores. Vorik opened it. Then he stopped laughing. The numbers made no sense. Every single cub had passed the final combat simulation. But that was not the strange part. The strange part was their scores. They were not just passing scores. They were the highest scores anyone had seen in 300 years. Vorik checked the data again. He ran it through verification systems. He looked for signs that someone had changed the numbers. But everything was correct. The scores were real. He leaned back in his chair and tried to understand what he was seeing. These were the same cubs who had failed their basic training 6 cycles ago. The same cubs who could not follow simple orders. The same cubs who had been sent to Kethis 4 because no one knew what else to do with them. What had happened? Vorik searched through the personnel files for Kethis 4. There was only one instructor assigned to the moon. A human female named Yuna. He read her service record. It was not impressive. She had served in the Republic Marines for 12 years. No medals, no special achievements. She had been injured in a minor battle and retired from active duty. Then she had taken a job as a training instructor because she needed work. There was nothing special about her. She was small, even for a human. Her combat scores were average. Her leadership evaluations were acceptable, but not outstanding. Vorik knew about humans. Everyone in the Coalition knew about humans. They were one of the weakest species in the galaxy. No claws, no fangs, no natural armor. They were slow compared to most species. They were fragile. A single blow that a felon could survive would kill a human. The only reason humans were in the Coalition at all was because they had proven useful in other ways. They were clever. They could build things. They were good at solving problems. But as warriors? No one took them seriously. And yet this human had done something to the felon cubs. Something that Vorik could not explain. He pulled up the training logs from Kethis 4. What he found confused him even more. The cubs were not training like felons anymore. They were running long distances instead of practicing short sprints. They were learning to stay still for hours instead of attacking immediately. They were studying tactics and strategy instead of fighting. None of this made sense. Felons were predators. Their entire culture was built around the hunt. They were fast, powerful, and deadly. Their natural instincts made them perfect warriors. Why would anyone teach them to ignore those instincts? Vorik decided he needed to see this for himself. He sent a message to his second-in-command, telling her that he would be gone for a few days. Then he boarded a small transport ship and set course for Kethis 4. The journey took 2 days. Kethis 4 was far from the main fleet routes, hidden in a quiet corner of Coalition space. As Vorik's ship approached, he saw why the moon had been chosen as a training ground. It was harsh and unforgiving. Mountains covered most of the surface. Rivers of freezing water cut through deep valleys. Forests of thick trees blocked the sun. It was not a pleasant place. It was a place where survival was difficult. Vorik landed at the small base on the moon's only flat area. A young felon met him at the landing pad. The cub stood at attention, his yellow eyes focused straight ahead. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply waited. This was strange. Felons were naturally restless. They hated standing still. Their instincts told them to move, to watch, to hunt. But this cub was as still as a statue. "Where is your instructor?" Vorik asked. "Instructor Yuna is at the training grounds, Commander," the cub said. His voice was calm and controlled. "I will take you to her." They walked through the base. Vorik saw more cubs along the way. All of them moved with purpose. All of them were quiet. None of them showed the wild energy that felons usually had. The training grounds were on the other side of a small hill. When Vorik reached the top, he stopped and stared. Below him, 40 felon cubs were running. But they were not sprinting like felons normally did. They were running slowly, at a steady pace, carrying heavy packs on their backs. They moved together in perfect formation, their steps matching exactly. In front of them, a small human woman ran at the same pace. She wore simple clothes and carried the same heavy pack. She did not look back at the cubs. She simply ran, and they followed. Vorik watched for a long time. The cubs ran for hours without stopping. Some of them were clearly in pain. Their legs were shaking. Their breathing was hard. But none of them stopped. None of them fell behind. When the run finally ended, the cubs collapsed on the ground. They were exhausted. But there was something in their eyes that Vorik had never seen before and failed. Warriors. Pride. The human woman walked among them, checking on each one. She spoke quietly, and Vorik could not hear what she said. But he saw the cubs respond to her. They listened. They nodded. Some of them even smiled. This was impossible. Felons did not respect weakness. They followed strength. And this human was not strong. She was small and slow and fragile. But they followed her anyway. Vorik walked down the hill toward the training grounds. The human saw him coming and stood at attention. Up close, she looked even less impressive. She was tired. Her hands were rough and scarred. Her eyes had the look of someone who had seen difficult things. "Commander Vorik," she said. Her voice was calm. "I was told you might visit. I came to see what you have done here," Vorik said. "Your cubs have the highest simulation scores in 300 years. How is that possible?" Yuna looked at her students, who were slowly getting back on their feet. "I trained them," she said simply. "You trained failed cubs to break records?" "I trained them to be something other than what they were," Yuna said. "They came here believing they were failures. They came here thinking their bodies had let them down. I taught them that their bodies were never the problem." Vorik did not understand. Then what was the problem? Yuna turned to look at him. Her eyes were steady and unafraid. "Their minds," she said. "They believed they had limits. I taught them that limits are a choice." Before Vorik could respond, one of the cubs shouted. The others immediately formed into ranks, standing at attention despite their exhaustion. They were ready for the next order. Vorik stared at them. 6 cycles ago, these cubs could not stand in a line. Now they moved like a single unit, disciplined and controlled. He had come to HFY expecting to find tricks or lies. Instead, he had found something that he could not explain, and that scared him more than anything else. Vorik stayed on HFY for 3 days. He watched everything. He took notes. He tried to understand what the human woman had done to change these cubs so completely. On the first morning, he woke early and went to the training grounds. The cubs were already there. It was still dark, and the air was freezing cold. Frost covered the ground. Vorik could see his breath forming clouds in front of his face. The cubs were not moving. They were sitting on the frozen ground in perfect rows, their eyes closed. They were not sleeping. They were simply sitting, completely still, in the terrible cold. Una sat at the front, facing them. She was also still. Her small human body was shaking from the cold, but she did not move. She did not complain. She simply sat. Vorik watched for 2 hours. Neither the cubs nor the human moved during that entire time. When the sun finally rose and brought some warmth, Una opened her eyes and spoke a single word. Rise. The cubs stood as one. Their bodies were stiff and cold. Some of them could barely move their legs. But they stood, and they waited for their next order. What was the purpose of that? Vorik asked Una as the cubs began their morning exercises. Patience, Una said. The mind wants comfort. The body wants warmth. Every moment they sat there, something inside them was screaming to move, to find heat, to escape the cold. They learned to ignore that voice. But why? Felons are ambush predators. They are naturally patient. Una shook her head. They are patient for short times. They can wait for prey to come close, then they strike. But what happens when the prey does not come? What happens when they must wait for days, not minutes? Their instincts fail them. They become restless. They make mistakes. She pointed to a young male cub named Tarek. He was stretching his cold muscles, preparing for the day's training. Tarek failed his original combat tests because he could not wait, Una said. He saw an opportunity and he attacked, even when the opportunity was a trap. He did this 3 times. 3 failures. They sent him here because they thought he would never learn. And now? Now he can wait for hours. Days, if necessary. Last week, I buried him in mud and told him to stay there until I returned. I came back 4 hours later. He had not moved. His body was screaming at him, but his mind said no. Vorik found this hard to believe. He had commanded felon warriors for 20 years. He knew their nature. They were not creatures of patience. They were creatures of action. But as the day continued, he saw more and more proof that Una was telling the truth. The cubs trained in ways that made no sense for felons. They ran long distances instead of short sprints. They carried heavy weights up mountains instead of practicing with their claws. They learned to fight with simple weapons instead of relying on their natural strength. In the afternoon, Vorik watched a combat exercise. 20 cubs were defending a small hill against the other 20. The attackers had every advantage. They had better position for an ambush. They had the sun behind them. They had more cubs who were skilled at close combat. But the defenders won. They won because they did not break. When the attackers charged, the defenders held their ground. When the attackers tried to circle around, the defenders adjusted their positions. When individual defenders fell, others took their places without hesitation. The attackers became frustrated. They made mistakes. And then the defenders struck back, hitting the attackers when they were confused and tired. It was not a felon victory. It was something else entirely. That evening, Vorik found Una in the mess hall. She was eating a simple meal of rice and vegetables. He sat across from her and studied her face. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her hands had fresh cuts and bruises. You train with them, Vorik said. Everything they do, you do. Yes. Why? You are the instructor. You could simply watch and give orders. Una put down her eating utensils. I asked them to do things that seem impossible. Things that hurt. Things that go against every instinct they have. How can I ask them to suffer if I am not willing to suffer with them? But you are human. Your body is weaker than theirs. The training must be much harder for you. It is, Yuna agreed. But that is the point. They see me struggling. They see me in pain. And they see me refuse to stop. If a weak human can do it, they think, then surely a felon can do it too. Vorik was beginning to understand. Yuna was not teaching the cubs new fighting techniques. She was teaching them a new way of thinking. She was breaking down everything they believed about themselves and building something new. The other instructors, Vorik said, the ones who trained them before, they tried to work with felon instincts. They tried to use the cubs' natural abilities. And they failed, Yuna said, because these cubs' instincts were wrong. They were too aggressive, too impulsive, too sure of their own strength. No amount of skill training would fix that. So you took away their instincts. Yuna shook her head. I showed them that instincts are not commands. They are suggestions. The body says attack, but the mind can say wait. The body says run, but the mind can say stand. The body says give up, but the mind can say continue. A young female cub entered the mess hall. Her name was Dani, and Vorik had seen her during the day's training. She was smaller than the other cubs, and she had struggled more than most. But she had never stopped. She had never asked for rest. Dani walked to Yuna and stood at attention. Instructor, I have completed the evening study assignment. Yuna nodded. Good. What did you learn? The Battle of Forgotten Valley, Dani said. A human unit was surrounded by enemy forces 10 times their size. They had no supplies, no support, no hope of rescue. They held for 40 days until relief finally arrived. And what was the lesson? Dani paused, thinking carefully. The enemy believed the humans would surrender after a few days. They thought no creature could endure such suffering. But the humans did not think about tomorrow or next week. They thought only about the next hour. And then the next. And then the next. They won because they refused to think about how long they had to endure. Yuna smiled slightly. Go rest. Tomorrow will be difficult. Dani bowed and left. Vorik watched her go, then turned back to Yuna. You are teaching them human history. I am teaching them human thinking, Yuna said. The body has limits. Every species knows this. But humans learned something long ago that other species have not yet understood. What is that? The limits of the body are not the same as the limits of the will. The body can be pushed far beyond what it thinks is possible. Pain can be ignored. Exhaustion can be overcome. Fear can be controlled. All it takes is a mind that refuses to accept what the body is telling it. Vorik sat in silence for a long moment. He had spent his entire career believing that warriors were made from strength and skill and natural ability. The best warriors came from the best bloodlines. The strongest species produced the strongest fighters, but this small human woman was suggesting something different. She was suggesting that the most important weapon was not the body at all. It was something that could not be measured or tested. It was the decision to keep going when everything said to stop. Tomorrow, Yuna said, standing up from her meal, I will show you the mountain. Then you will understand why these cubs will become the greatest warriors the Coalition has ever seen. She left the mess hall, and Vorik sat alone with his thoughts. He had come to Kethis expecting to find a trick or a mistake. Instead, he was beginning to realize that everything he believed about warfare might be wrong, and that was the most frightening thought of all. The next morning, Vorik followed Yuna and the cubs to the base of the mountain. It was the largest mountain on Kethis 4, a massive tower of rock and ice that reached high into the gray sky. Snow covered its peak. Clouds wrapped around its middle. The bottom was covered in thick forest and crossed by rivers of freezing water. Vorik had seen the mountain from the base, but he had not understood its purpose. Now, standing at its base, he began to feel worried. This is the test, Una said. Every cub must complete it before they can graduate. We call it simply the mountain. She pointed upward, tracing a path with her finger. They start here. They climb the cliff face to the first plateau. Then they cross the river. Then they run through the forest to the peak. Then they run back down to the base. Vorik studied the route. It was insane. The cliff was nearly vertical, with smooth rock that offered no easy handholds. The river was wide and fast-moving, filled with chunks of ice. The forest was dense and dark, with fallen trees blocking every path. The total distance had to be at least 30 kilometers. How long does it take? He asked. The time limit is 6 hours, Una said. But there is another rule. They must complete the course in pairs. If one cub falls, the other must carry them. If one cub cannot continue, both fail. Vorik stared at her. That is impossible. No felon could complete this course while carrying another. A felon could not, Una agreed. But my cubs are not just felons anymore. She raised her hand and shouted a command. The cubs immediately formed into pairs. Vorik noticed that the pairs were not random. Stronger cubs were matched with weaker ones. Fast cubs were paired with slow ones. It was designed so that someone would always have to carry someone else. Begin, Una said. The cubs ran toward the cliff and started climbing. Vorik watched in amazement as they moved up the rock face. Their claws should have made the climb easy, but the rock was too smooth. The claws slipped and scratched uselessly against the surface, but the cubs did not stop. They found tiny cracks and edges to grip. They helped each other, one cub pushing while the other pulled. They worked together, moving slowly but steadily upward. One cub slipped and fell. His partner immediately grabbed his arm and held on. For a long moment, both cubs hung from the cliff by a single handhold. Vorik was sure they would fall. But the cub above pulled with all his strength, and slowly, painfully, he lifted his partner back onto the rock dock they kept climbing. Una stood beside Vorik, watching her students. Her face showed no emotion, but her eyes were intense and focused. The cliff teaches them to trust, she said. They cannot climb alone. They must depend on their partner. For felons, this is difficult. They are proud creatures. They do not like to need help. And the river? The river teaches them to suffer. The water is cold enough to kill. Their fur becomes heavy and wet. Every instinct tells them to get out, to find warmth. But they must keep moving. They must ignore what their bodies are telling them. An hour passed. The first cubs reached the river. Vorik watched through a viewing scope as they plunged into the freezing water. He could see their faces twist in pain as the cold hit them. Their powerful bodies began to shake uncontrollably, but they kept going. They pushed through the water, holding on to each other to keep from being swept away by the current. When they reached the other side, they did not stop to rest. They immediately began running into the forest. The forest teaches them to endure, Una said. The run is long. Their muscles will burn. Their lungs will scream for air. Every step will be agony. But they cannot stop. If they stop, they fail. If they fail, their partner fails. They learn that their pain is not as important as their duty to each other. Vorik saw something moving in the forest. It was Dani, the small female cub he had noticed before. She was running, but something was wrong. Her partner, a large male cub named Genu, was draped across her shoulders. What happened to him? Vorik asked why Ewan had checked the device on her wrist. His legs gave out 3 kilometers ago. Muscle failure. He cannot walk. Then they will fail. She cannot carry him the entire way. Una did not answer. She simply watched. Vorik kept his scope on Dani. The small cub was struggling. Gina was nearly twice her weight, and she was already exhausted from the river crossing. Her legs were shaking with every step. Her face was twisted in pain, but she did not stop. She did not put him down. She kept moving, one step at a time, through the dark forest. 2 hours later, Danny emerged from the forest at the base of the mountain. She collapsed the moment she crossed the finish line, unable to take another step. Jinnu rolled off her shoulders and lay beside her, unconscious from exhaustion. Vorik walked toward them. Danny's eyes were open, but she was not seeing anything. Her body had pushed so far beyond its limits that her mind had gone to some other place. Yuna knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did well," she said quietly. "Rest now." Danny's eyes slowly focused on Yuna's face. "I did not stop," she whispered. "I wanted to. My body wanted to. But I said no." "That is what makes you a warrior," Yuna said. "Not your claws. Not your speed. Not your strength. Your will. Your choice to keep going when everything tells you to quit." Vorik looked around. Other cubs were finishing the course, most of them carrying their partners. Some could barely walk. Some had collapsed and were being carried by medical staff. But all of them had finished. All 40 cubs had completed the impossible course. He turned to Yuna. "I have seen felon warriors train for years. I have seen the best of them, the champions and heroes. None of them could do what your cubs just did." "No," Yuna agreed, "because they trained their bodies. I trained their minds. But how? How do you teach someone to ignore pain? To push past exhaustion? These are not things that can be learned from books or lectures." Yuna stood up and looked at her exhausted students. Many of them were crying. Not from sadness, but from the release of emotion that came after such extreme effort. "Humans learned this lesson long ago," she said. "We had to. We were not the fastest or strongest creatures on our world. We were prey before we were predators. We survived because we learned to do one thing that no other creature could do." "What thing?" "We learned to run. Not fast, like a felon. Slow and steady, for hours and days. We would chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. We called it persistence hunting. The animal would run away, and we would follow. It would run again, and we would follow again. Eventually, the animal would simply stop. Its body would give up, and we would catch it." Vorik had heard of this. It was one of the strange facts about humans that most species found amusing. The slow, weak humans who caught food by simply refusing to stop chasing it. But now he understood that it was not amusing at all. It was terrifying. "The animal's body told it to stop," Yuna continued. "Its muscles burned. Its heart pounded. Every instinct screamed that it had to rest. And it listened. It obeyed its body. But we did not. We kept going. We overrode every signal our body sent us. And that is why we survived." She looked at Vorik with those tired, steady eyes. "That is what I am teaching these cubs. Not fighting techniques. Not tactics or strategy. I am teaching them the most dangerous skill in the galaxy. I am teaching them to disobey their own bodies. To refuse to quit. To keep going when every part of them is screaming to stop." Vorik looked at the cubs lying on the ground. They were broken, exhausted, pushed far beyond anything they had ever experienced. But in their eyes, he saw something new, something that had not been there. When they arrived on this moon as failures, he saw the understanding that they were not limited by their bodies, that they could choose to go further than their instincts allowed, that the only true limit was the decision to stop. And that was the most dangerous thing a warrior could learn. 3 months after Vorik's visit to Kefis 4, the cubs received their first real mission. The message came in the middle of the night. Yuna gathered her students in the main hall and read it aloud. A colony world named Irith 7 had been attacked by the Krath. The insect-like creatures had already destroyed 3 coalition battalions. 40,000 civilians were trapped in the capital city, surrounded on all sides. The Cubs were being sent as a delaying force. Their mission was simple: hold the defensive line until evacuation ships could arrive. The ships would take 72 hours to reach the planet. No one expected the Cubs to survive that long. 3 full battalions of experienced warriors had fallen in less than a day. 40 Cubs with no combat experience had no chance. But Una simply nodded and told her students to prepare. They landed on Earth 7 as the sun was setting. The city was burning. Smoke rose from destroyed buildings. The sounds of distant explosions echoed through the empty streets. The Krath had already taken the outer districts. Their soldiers filled the ruins like a dark flood. There were thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. They clicked and hissed as they moved, communicating in their strange language. The Cubs took position at the inner wall, the last barrier between the Krath and the civilians. Hyan, the young male that Una had chosen as their leader, studied the enemy forces through his viewing scope. "There are too many," said Bora, a female Cub standing beside him. "We cannot hold against those numbers." Hyan lowered his scope. "We do not need to defeat them. We only need to delay them. 72 hours. That is our mission." 72 hours, Bora repeated. "Against that?" "1 hour at a time," Hyan said. "We do not think about 72 hours. We think about the next hour, then the next, then the next." It was what Una had taught them. Do not look at the impossible task ahead. Look only at the next small step. Survive this moment, then survive the next. The Krath attacked at midnight. They came in waves, thousands of insect bodies rushing toward the wall. The Cubs opened fire with their weapons, cutting down the front lines. But more came. Always more. The first wave lasted 2 hours. When it finally ended, the ground before the wall was covered with Krath bodies. But the Cubs had used much of their ammunition, and some of them were wounded. "Rotate the injured to the back," Hyan ordered. "Fresh fighters to the front. Save ammunition. Make every shot count." The Cubs obeyed without question. They moved smoothly, like parts of a single machine. Those who had trained together knew each other's movements without needing to speak. The second wave came at dawn. This time, the Krath brought heavy weapons. They blasted holes in the wall and poured through the gaps. The Cubs fell back to secondary positions, just as they had practiced on Kethis 4. They had prepared for this. They had trained for every possibility. By noon, 12 hours had passed. The Cubs had lost 4 of their number. 36 remained. The Krath had lost hundreds, maybe thousands. But they kept coming. Hyan had not slept. None of them had. Their bodies were screaming for rest, but they refused to listen. They remembered the mountain. They remembered the freezing river and the endless run through the forest. They remembered what Una had taught them. Pain is information, not a command. You can acknowledge it and keep going. At sunset, the Krath broke through the eastern wall. 100 of them poured into the city, heading straight for the civilian shelters. Hyan gathered 10 Cubs and went to stop them. The fighting was brutal. The Krath were strong and fast, with sharp claws and armored bodies. In close combat, they had every advantage. But the Cubs did not fight like felons. They did not charge in with claws and teeth. They worked together, covering each other, creating opportunities. When one Cub attacked, 2 others protected his sides. When one fell, another immediately took his place. They killed all 100 Krath, but they lost 3 more Cubs doing it. Only 7 returned from that fight. "We cannot continue like this," Bora said. Her fur was matted with blood, some of it hers, most of it not. "At this rate, we will all be dead before the evacuation ships arrive." "Then we changed tactics," Hyan said. "No more open fighting. We make them pay for every step. We slow them down. We make them afraid. For the next 2 days, the cubs became ghosts. They set traps in the ruined streets. They attacked from the shadows and disappeared before the craft could respond. They made the enemy afraid to move forward, afraid of what might be waiting in the darkness. The craft began to hesitate. They had never faced an enemy like this. Coalition forces usually fought in the open, relying on superior firepower. These strange creatures fought differently. They seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. On the third day, 60 hours into the battle, Hyan collapsed. He had not slept in 3 days. He had been fighting constantly, leading his cubs, making decisions. His body had finally reached its absolute limit. His muscles stopped working. His mind went dark. Danny found him in a destroyed building, unconscious and barely breathing. She dragged him to the medical area and forced water into his mouth. Slowly, he opened his eyes. How long? He whispered. 12 hours left, Danny said. The evacuation ships are close. Most of the civilians have already been loaded. Hyan tried to stand, but his legs would not obey. I cannot feel my body. You push too hard. Instructor Yuna warned us this could happen. Then you must lead. Finish the mission. Danny was afraid. She was one of the smallest cubs. She had always doubted herself. But she remembered what Yuna had told her after she completed the mountain. The body is not what makes you strong. The will is. I will finish it, she said. She left Hyan in the medical area and returned to the front lines. 31 cubs remained. They were all exhausted, running on nothing but determination. But they were still fighting. 12 hours, Danny told them. We hold for 12 more hours. Then we go home. The final craft assault came 4 hours before the evacuation was complete. The insects threw everything they had at the remaining defenders. Wave after wave crashed against the cubs' positions. The cubs did not break. They had learned something that the craft could not understand. They had learned that the body's limits were lies. They had learned that pain was just a sensation, not a command. They had learned that as long as the mind refused to quit, the body would keep moving. When the first evacuation ship lifted off, 28 cubs were still fighting. When the last ship departed with the final civilians, 26 remained. The cubs fell back to their own transport. Still firing at the pursuing craft, they loaded their wounded, including Hyan, who had regained consciousness and was directing the retreat despite being unable to stand as the transport lifted off. Danny looked down at the burning city. The craft were swarming over the positions they had held for 72 hours. Thousands of insect soldiers filled the streets. They had held. Against impossible odds, they had held long enough. 9 cubs had died. Their names would be tattooed into the fur of every survivor, never to be forgotten. But 43,000 civilians were alive because 40 young warriors had refused to quit. The transport flew toward the waiting coalition fleet. Inside, the exhausted cubs sat in silence. Some were crying. Some were sleeping. Some simply stared at nothing, too tired to think or feel. Danny sat beside Hyan's medical pod. He was awake, watching her with tired eyes. We did it, she said. Yes, Hyan replied. But it was not our strength that saved those people. It was not our speed or our claws. No, Danny agreed. It was what Instructor Yuna taught us. The body wants to stop. The mind can say no. The most dangerous lesson in the galaxy, Hyan said quietly. And now the whole coalition will know that we learned it. Danny looked at the other cubs. Failed warriors, they had been called. Hopeless cases. Sent to a forgotten moon to be forgotten. Now. They were heroes, and it was all because a single human woman had taught them the one thing that humans knew better than any other species in the galaxy, How to refuse to surrender. Commander Vorik sat alone in his office, reading the after-action reports from Irith 7. The data was spread across multiple screens, filling the room with soft blue light. He had been reading for hours, but he kept going back to the same numbers, the same impossible facts. 40 cubs against 10,000 Krath, 72 hours of continuous combat, 43,000 civilians evacuated, 9 cubs killed, 31 survivors. 3 full coalition battalions had fallen to the same enemy in less than a day. Experienced warriors with superior weapons and training had been overrun and destroyed, but the cubs had held. Vorik pulled up the biometric data from the cubs' combat armor. This was what disturbed him most. The numbers showed what had happened inside their bodies during the battle. Their heart rates had reached levels that should have caused death. Their muscles had torn and retorn from constant use. Their stress hormones had been so high that their organs should have failed. Every warning system in their bodies had been screaming at them to stop, to rest, to give up. But they had not stopped. They had ignored every signal. They had pushed past every limit that biology had set for them. It was impossible. The felon body was well understood. There were clear limits to what it could endure. These cubs had gone far beyond those limits, and somehow they had survived. Vorik needed to understand. He traveled to the medical station where the cubs were recovering and found Yuna sitting beside Hyan's bed. The young commander was sleeping, his body finally beginning to heal after pushing itself nearly to destruction. Yuna looked up as Vorik entered. She did not stand or salute. She was not military anymore, not really. She was something else, something that Vorik did not have a name for. He will recover, she said. They all will. The body is good at healing, once the mind finally allows it to rest. What you did should be impossible, Vorik said. He did not mean for his voice to shake, but it did. The data shows that these cubs pushed past every known limit of their species. They should be dead. All of them should be dead. Yuna looked at Hyan's sleeping face. The body does not know its true limits. It sets false boundaries, warning signs that trigger long before real damage is done. It does this to protect itself, to keep reserves for emergencies. But these cubs pushed past the reserves. They pushed past everything. Yes, because I taught them to. Vorik sat down heavily in a chair. His legs felt weak. I have commanded warriors for 40 years. I thought I understood strength. I thought I knew what made a soldier capable of great things. And now? Now I realize I understood nothing. He looked at Yuna with something close to fear. You taught them to override their own survival instincts. You taught them to ignore every warning their bodies give them. That is not training. That is something else. Yuna was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft and tired. Humans learned this lesson in the worst possible way, she said. We learned it through thousands of years of suffering. Wars that lasted generations. Disasters that killed millions. We learned that the body will always try to quit before it truly needs to. And we learned that the mind can say no. But that knowledge is dangerous. Yes, it is the most dangerous knowledge in the galaxy. A warrior who cannot be stopped by pain or exhaustion or fear is more powerful than any weapon. But it comes with a cost. What cost? Yuna looked at her hands. They were scarred and rough, the hands of someone who had pushed her own body past its limits many times. The body does not forget, she said. Every time you push past a limit, you damage something. Every time you ignore pain, you leave a scar that does not show on the surface. I have pushed myself this way for 30 years. My bones ache when it rains. My muscles never fully relax. My heart works harder than it should. She met Vorik's eyes. But I am still here. Still fighting. Still teaching. because the alternative was to give up. And humans do not give up. Vorik thought about this for a long time. He thought about all the battles he had seen, all the warriors he had lost. How many of them had died because they believed they had reached their limits? How many had stopped fighting when their bodies told them to, even though they could have kept going? The Felon High Council will want to know about this, he said finally. They will want human instructors for all their military academies. They have already asked, Yuna said. I received the request this morning, and other species will ask too. When they hear what happened on Erith 7, they will all want to learn what you taught these cubs. Yuna nodded slowly. Yes, and that is what I am afraid of. Afraid? Why? Because this knowledge is a gift and a curse. It can save lives, as it did on Erith 7, but it can also destroy them. If every species in the galaxy learns to push past their limits, what will happen? How many wars will be fought by soldiers who refuse to stop? How many will die because they have forgotten how to surrender? Vorik had not thought about this. He had been so amazed by what the cubs had accomplished that he had not considered what might happen if this lesson spread. You taught them anyway, he said. I taught them because they were already broken. Yuna replied. They were failures. They had nothing left to lose. I gave them something to believe in, and they became heroes. But that does not mean this lesson should be given to everyone. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the stars were cold and distant. The same stars that had watched humans learn their terrible lessons thousands of years ago. The will is the most powerful weapon in the galaxy, she said. It can overcome any enemy, any obstacle, any limitation. But it must be used carefully. A weapon that cannot be controlled is not a weapon. It is a disaster. Vorik joined her at the window. Then what do you recommend? Yuna was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke words that Vorik would remember for the rest of his life. Teach the lesson only to those who understand its cost. Teach it only to those who have already learned humility and discipline. Teach it only to those who have something worth fighting for beyond their own glory. She turned to look at him, and her tired eyes held a wisdom that went far beyond her years. The body has limits. The will does not. But the greatest warriors are not those who ignore their limits. They are those who understand why limits exist and choose to break them only when something more important is at stake. Vorik thought about the cubs sleeping in the medical bay. They had learned this lesson. They had broken their limits to save 43,000 innocent lives. They had pushed past everything their bodies told them because they had something worth fighting for. That was the key. That was what made the lesson a gift instead of a curse. A year later, human instructors were assigned to every Felon military academy. 5 years after that, 12 other coalition species had requested the same training. 10 years after Era 7, the coalition military had been transformed, but it was not transformed by new weapons or new technology. It was transformed by a simple truth that one small human woman had carried from a forgotten world. The body will always tell you to stop. It will send pain and exhaustion and fear, all designed to make you quit. But these signals are not commands. They are suggestions, and the mind can say no. On a distant training moon, an older Yuna still taught her lessons. Her hair had gone gray. Her body was more scarred than ever. But her eyes still held that steady, unbreakable will that had changed the galaxy. She watched her newest students struggle up the mountain, carrying each other, refusing to quit. She saw them fall and rise again. She saw them push past every limit they believed they had, and she smiled. The most dangerous lesson in the galaxy was also the most important, not because it taught people to ignore their bodies, but because it taught them that they were stronger than they ever believed possible. The body has limits. The will does not. And when the body tells you to stop, you do not have to listen. That was the human lesson. That was the gift that one species, small and weak and fragile, had given to the galaxy the gift of never giving up.